Jack had always loved the idea of camping alone. The quiet, the peace, it felt like a break from his busy life. One day he packed his gear, drove deep into the forest, and found the perfect spot. There were no other people around, just the trees and the sound of the wind. The sun was setting when Jack set up his tent. He gathered some wood for a small fire. As the fire crackled, he sat down to eat. Everything seemed normal, but Jack couldn't shake a strange feeling. The woods felt different, like someone or something was watching him. He brushed it off, thinking he was just being paranoid. The night grew darker, and Jack decided to get some sleep. Inside his tent, the only sound he could hear was the rustling of leaves outside. He told himself it was just the wind, but as the night went on, the noises became louder. It sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy. He opened his eyes, his heart racing. "Is someone there?" he whispered, but there was no answer. He stayed awake for a while, but eventually, the noises stopped and he fell asleep again. The next morning, Jack woke up early. The sun was shining and the woods seemed calm again. He laughed at himself for being scared last night. "It was just my imagination," he said, packing up his gear to explore. He walked deeper into the forest, admiring the tall trees and the fresh air. But as he went farther, he started to notice something strange. There were marks on some of the trees, deep scratches, as if something with sharp claws had torn into the bark. He touched one of the marks. It looked fresh, not old like it had been there for years. Jack felt uneasy but pushed the thought away. He continued walking until he reached a small stream. Kneeling down, he cupped his hands to drink the cold water. As he did, he noticed something odd on the ground nearby. It was a pile of small rocks, stacked neatly in a strange pattern. Who could have done this? Jack thought, looking around. There was no one in sight. The woods were silent except for the flowing water. He felt that strange feeling again, like someone was watching him, but he saw no one. Jack hurried back to his campsite, feeling a bit nervous. When he got back, the sun was starting to set again. He lit another fire and sat quietly, staring into the flames. The forest around him was silent, too silent. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire. That night, as he lay in his tent, the noises came back. First, it was the rustling of leaves, then the slow, heavy footsteps. This time, they were closer, just outside the tent. Jack held his breath, trying not to make a sound. Suddenly, there was a scratch at the side of his tent. Long, slow, like nails dragging across the fabric. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He grabbed his flashlight and, with shaking hands, unzipped the tent. Shining the light outside, he saw nothing, just the trees and the dark shadows. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Jack sat up for the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. Every small noise made him jump, but nothing else happened. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, he quickly packed his things. "I need to get out of here," he thought. But as he started walking back toward his car, something strange happened. No matter how far he walked, the path seemed unfamiliar. Trees he hadn't seen before, turns that didn't make sense. It was as if the forest itself was changing, trapping him inside. Hours passed, and Jack began to panic. He was lost. His phone had no signal, and the sun was already starting to set again. He found a clearing and decided to set up camp one last time, hoping he could find his way in the morning. That night, as the fire flickered weakly, the noises returned, louder than before. Footsteps, whispers, and the scratching sound all around him. Jack didn't bother with the tent this time. He just sat by the fire, holding his flashlight tight. Then he saw it. A shadow moving between the trees. It was tall, much taller than any person. The shadow stopped just at the edge of the light from his fire. Jack could barely make out its shape, but he knew it was watching him. The shadow stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. Jack's hands trembled, gripping the flashlight tightly. He pointed the light toward the figure, but as soon as the beam hit it, the shadow vanished into the darkness. Jack's heart raced. He couldn't understand what was happening. Was it just his mind playing tricks, or was something real out there? He sat by the fire, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. Every noise, every gust of wind made him jump. Hours passed, but the shadow didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted off into a restless sleep by the dying fire. When he woke up, it was morning again. The sun peeked through the trees, but the air felt heavy. Jack was desperate to get out of the forest. He picked up his things and started walking in what he thought was the direction of his car. But as he moved through the woods, the strange feeling of being followed never left him. The woods seemed endless. Jack walked for hours, but the scenery never changed. The same trees, the same bushes. It was like he was walking in circles. His throat was dry, his legs aching, but he didn't stop. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was close behind him, watching, waiting. Then he heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were faster, closer. Jack's heart pounded as he broke into a run. Branches scraped his face and arms, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away. But no matter how fast he ran, the footsteps kept up with him, matching his pace. He glanced back but saw nothing. The footsteps were there, but the source was invisible. Panic surged through him as he stumbled and fell to the ground. As Jack lay there, gasping for breath, he noticed something on the ground next to him. A footprint. It wasn't his. The print was large, much larger than any human's, and it was fresh. Jack scrambled to his feet and kept running, his mind racing. The forest seemed darker now, even though it was still daylight. The trees felt taller, their branches closing in on him like a cage. He was lost, more lost than he had ever been. After what felt like hours, Jack came across a small cabin. It looked old and abandoned, but it was the only shelter in sight. Without thinking, he ran toward it and burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him. The cabin was dusty and empty. There was no furniture, just a single broken window and a fireplace filled with ash. Jack slumped against the door, trying to catch his breath. For a moment, it was quiet. The footsteps had stopped, but then the scratching started again. This time, it was on the door. Slow, deliberate scratches, like something outside was testing the wood, trying to find a way in. Jack backed away, his eyes wide with fear. The door rattled, and then there was a loud thud, as if something heavy had slammed against it. Jack grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and held it like a weapon, though he knew it wouldn't help. The thing outside wasn't human. He could feel it in his bones. The door creaked, but it held. For now, Jack knew he couldn't stay in the cabin forever. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the shadows outside grew longer. The scratching on the door continued, sometimes slow, sometimes furious. It was like whatever was outside was toying with him, enjoying his fear. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. Jack held his breath, listening to the silence. Then, without warning, the window shattered. Jack jumped back as glass flew everywhere. He shone his flashlight toward the window, but saw nothing. The darkness outside seemed deeper than ever, almost alive. Then he heard it again, footsteps inside the cabin. Something had entered. Jack's flashlight flickered, the beam barely piercing the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer, but no matter where he pointed the light, he saw nothing. In a panic, Jack bolted for the door, throwing it open and running into the night. He didn't care where he was going, as long as it was away from that cabin. The footsteps followed him, faster this time, almost running. Jack's legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The thing was right behind him. He could feel its presence, hear its breath. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape. Just when Jack thought he couldn't run any longer, he burst into a clearing. In the center stood an ancient, twisted tree. Its bark was black, its branches reaching toward the sky like claws. Something about the tree felt wrong, unnatural. Jack stumbled toward it, drawn by a strange force. As he got closer, he saw the carvings again, the the same ones he had seen on the trees earlier. But these were deeper, more complex, as if telling a story he couldn't understand. Suddenly, the air around him grew cold. The presence was back, surrounding him. Jack turned in every direction, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Then, the whispers began. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, coming from all around him. Jack couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing, as if the forest itself was speaking to him, telling him he didn't belong. The ground beneath him started to shake. The tree seemed to pulse with energy, its branches twisting in the wind. Jack felt like he was being pulled toward it, as if the tree wanted him to come closer. But before he could move, the ground gave way beneath him. Jack fell into darkness, the whispers and footsteps fading as he plummeted into the unknown. Jack woke up in total darkness. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious, but the cold, damp air told him he was underground. His flashlight was gone, but he could still hear the whispers, faint and far away. He tried to stand, but his body was weak. Every muscle ached, and his mind felt foggy, like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, a light appeared in the distance, flickering like a flame. Jack dragged himself toward it, desperate for any sign of escape. As he got closer, he saw that the light was coming from a small fire, surrounded by figures cloaked in shadow. They were watching him. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figures didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, staring, as if waiting for something. And then, without a sound, they vanished. The fire flickered out, leaving Jack alone in the dark once more. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing in his ears. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew they were calling him deeper into the darkness. Jack took a step forward, then another. He didn't know where he was going, but he felt like he had no choice. The forest had claimed him, and there was no escape. The story ends with Jack's fate unknown, leaving the mystery of the forest and the presence within it unsolved.